aspects of what happened, and the fact that it seems so hard to get that, speaks to my way of thinking, a profound failure of our institutions, a kind of fraud that is imposed upon us that we have a kind of sovereign government or self-government when, the four of us sitting around the room, around this table, for instance, we're not insignificant individuals. We're not alone. We understand in various public opinion surveys that a growing number of people, a large percentage of people, just don't really have confidence any longer in the official story of what took us into the war on terror, what's taking us into this progressive loss of our civil liberties, the reality that we may already be in a structure of government, the continuity of government that Peter Dale Scott writes about, that there's already a constitutional transformation that has taken place on a secret level, and we're running according to some kind of emergency measures regime where people who are really in charge are not publicly accountable in any way. Is there other dimensions we can bring up about the Canadian, in our own country, looking at this global situation, how we can read it as Canadians and affect change within our own constitutional framework, our own supposedly sovereign institutions?
Well, I think that the biggest problem really is the normalization of all this. It's just been normalized and internalized, not only by the media, but by ordinary people, and that in fact is the cool thing to be. That's the way it is. And just as our colleague said earlier on, that the people just don't really care, cynical, whatever. It's just sort of a normalization.
Sorry, yeah, can I add something? Sorry to interrupt. But it's like you mentioned the media there. Like I came in today and turned on CBC. So I get the picture. CBC is supposed to be a totem of Canadian society, and I call it the conservative broadcasting centre, because of the supine propaganda which they indulge in. And, like they were talking about piracy. They were talking about piracy and how the West's coming to save the day with pirates on the Horn of Africa. And it reminded me of, St. Augustine writes of how Alexander the Great encountered a pirate and said, "How dare you go around the waters stealing people's things and terrorizing the waters?" And the pirate replied, "Well, you do exactly the same, but they call you an emperor." And I mean, that really sums up the world we live in. And then to put the icing on the cake, they had the Saudi foreign minister, a man who represents the kleptocracy, as if he was some kind of ally, saying, "Oh, we'll throw in soldiers to help with the war on piracy." And it was, and the irony was completely missed by the presenters, because the truth is they want slave governments, and they went into Afghanistan because the Taliban weren't willing to cooperate. They went into Iraq because Saddam stood up to the West. They'll never invade Egypt because Hosni Mubarak is a puppet. They'll never invade Saudi Arabia because the kleptocracy there is obedient. They killed Salvador Allende in Chile because he wasn't obedient. They staged coups against Hugo Chavez because he wasn't obedient. And that's the truth. And like you say, Canadian soldiers are going to be killed. And this word, the Taliban, I mean, how do we know they're the Taliban? I always say, do they have a membership card in their pocket? I mean, they said this in the Vietnam War, didn't they? Saying, "Oh, the Viet Cong," and then we found out it was just villagers. And it's the same with the Afghani people. I mean, the sad fact is, how do we know they're the Taliban when we murder them, massacre them with these, grotesque weapons? And it's all funded by the taxpayers, as is the CBC. I mean, it's unbelievable, really, isn't it?
It is, well said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Taliban, one thing the Taliban did when they were in power in Afghanistan is they cut the drug trade considerably. So since the Northern Alliance was backed by the United States to take power, essentially we have a government of drug lords. And there's been an enormous increase in the export of opium or heroin out of Afghanistan.
Thanks for your speech. I really liked the way you explained Canada's role in the fight on terrorism. They said they broke international rules of laws and all that. there's this course I took last semester. It was on the war, well, defining terrorism. So many people defining terrorism. We just had to go through them like a big book, different definitions, and the main thing was trying to define what is terrorism. So my main point is Canada would be breaking a rule only if terrorism is defined. It's fighting a person or a thing that's not defined yet. So it's not breaking a rule and it's getting away with that. So I think the root thing to be done is try to make clear what is it that they're fighting, and what is it that is the rule, and what is it that's being broken. Unless that's not clearly defined, I'm sure our philosopher prof over there would be interested in a very abstract thing as that. It's a clear line that needs to be drawn. The crosser of that line would be clear, visible. Nobody's crossing any line right now. And this keeps on happening. Like you said, going on and on and on.
Well, you're right about it. And it's not only terrorism, there are a number of other things that need to be defined. Both John and Michael talked about a war of aggression, which is what we've participated in Afghanistan. It's what happened in Iraq, have been called the supreme international crime in the Nuremberg tribunal. And yet there is no official accepted definition at the moment of crime of aggression. If you look into the International Criminal Court and the Rome statutes that founded it, it was set up to look at, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 major kinds of crime. Crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, or a war of aggression. And the first 3 are cooking along okay, but strange to say, the major powers and those that control the United Nations have been unable to come up with a definition of war of aggression. Isn't that strange, isn't that peculiar, that they haven't been able to come up with a good definition? And therefore, it's difficult to nail them when they do what are obviously wars of aggression. So this idea of getting some of these key terms and insisting not only that they be defined, but that the definitions then be accepted by these bodies is very important. John, did you want to say something?
Well, I thought that was very good, the policy shell game that's going on, which not only enables you to direct your attack on anybody, because this is a blanket term that can just be applied to anyone. You're quite right at that. But you also emphasize that it's something that automatically vindicates what you're doing, because there's nothing defined that you can break. So it not only is usable against the other, but it is automatically justifies what you're doing because there isn't any meaning to it. And that is really an Orwellian situation or a totalitarian situation where you just basically declare meaning by fiat, and if they disagree with you, they're terrorists. But if you attack innocents, then you're representing the free world and so forth. So we really do need criteria, and I think what Graeme just said is so true. I mean, it's just so poignantly true that here we have the worst problem we've got going on, which is the supreme crime. And it isn't just the Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Charter has transitivity into international laws that now exist and into our own criminal code. We have crimes against humanity defined in our criminal code, and they're quite clear on what those crimes are. But with respect to the one that is the leader of all the rest, because that's also part of international law, the reason it's called the supreme crime, because all the other crimes follow from it. And so the thing that starts it all, the supreme crime, is the one thing that isn't defined. And it's really quite monstrous. And then the terrorism one, I mean, when you think of it, the word terrorism came from the French Revolution, and that was an instrument of government. An instrument of government against people that it declared, we all know the story of the French Revolution. But suddenly the word terrorist has been inverted so that it's now used by the government. I mean, they now just use the word terrorism to apply what's against the government in the same way that we used the word to apply to the government. And indeed, now it's the meaning of terrorism means that it isn't a government applying it. So we have this process of why I said Orwellian is a double think that's built right into the whole process of perception and the normalization of crime as acceptable. And I think you're quite right that it really does go down to these criteria. I mean, what is terrorism? In fact, the operation that most intrigues me about this whole process is that you project onto the enemy what you are doing yourself as your justification for attacking it. That's it again and again. So when they use the word terrorist, if you say, well, what terror really means, let's just look at the dictionary. It's going to give us a good criterion, and we'll be able to work out a philosophical criterion that applies to all. But certainly it involves causing great fear in other people of loss of limb or life or something precious to them. We do cause enormous fear by terror of what's going to be lost, your life or your limb and your well-being and your relations and so forth. So what are they doing all along in Afghanistan? They are creating a huge fear, and indeed that war criminal act against Iraq was shock and awe. They were advertising beforehand, this is an act of supreme terror, shock and awe. And it's mostly against innocent people, like the 500,000 children that have been killed through the process of deliberately destroying life infrastructures of the public and so on. So you have an extra twist here. You not only have a double think going on, but you have the other being attacked on account of doing what you yourself are doing. And that just seems to be a closed circle of operation that goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
But I couldn't help just following up on one thing John said, which was the 500,000 children killed in Iraq. I keep trying to think, and this is before the invasion, of course, of 2003. This was through the so-called sanctions. I keep thinking of what it would be like if some country in the Middle East did this to, let's say, Canada, killed 500,000 children. I mean, a few years ago, several of us wrote an article, you can find it in the journal Medicine and Conflict, on precisely the conscious destruction of the water treatment facilities of Iraq. This was not collateral damage or accidental or anything. There is a formerly classified document, which I was quite shocked to read, which was produced in January 1991, just before the invasion of 91, and just after some months of sanctions against Iraq, called Iraq Water Treatment Vulnerabilities, which goes in detail into the Iraqi water supply and treatment system. It says the sanctions are already degrading it. It names the epidemic diseases that can be expected to come about. It talks about how Iraq does not have the equipment to repair its own system, and that we can expect the system to degrade further if things continue as follows. Now, we know that the UK and the US received that study in January 1991. What did they do after that? They prevented for a decade the repair of Iraq's water treatment facilities. They even targeted them during the invasion, the bombing of 1991, as well as targeting the hydroelectric stations crucial to that water supply. So those 500,000 children, many of whom died from diarrheal diseases that were preventable and that would have been prevented under Iraq's quite good water supply and treatment system previously, were killed consciously, not as, don't accept the stuff that they were collateral damage. This was known about, it's bragged about in at least one U.S. military document. He doesn't mention the children, but he talks with great joy about the public health catastrophe which was successfully created in Iraq. Now, I ask you to think about what would be said if that were done by, let us say,